Right, ladies and gentlemen, I think we will begin. Thank you very much for being here. It's lovely to see you. I want to introduce myself, Alison Scott Bowman. I'm a professor here in law, in the law department, and we have two very distinguished speakers here this evening. Before I introduce them, I'm just going to give you the context very briefly of how this evening has been made possible. About 2.5 years ago, I decided that the sort of standoff that is common between academics and parliamentarians in Westminster should be resolved. So this is a lecture series which will be engaging with politicians as much as we can here at SOAS, and it's called ICOP. If you want to talk at the end to anybody, Nina is part of the ICOP team and Rana is part of the ICOP team, as is Professor David Renton, part of the ICOP team. The reason I mention parliamentarians is because we've also now set up an all-party parliamentary group, which means that we are in the corridors of power. We can run events like this in the Houses of Parliament, in the Palace of Westminster, but we're also continuing to have a presence here in SOAS. And it's a very interesting process because we started knowing nothing about democratic processes, and we've learnt a lot about how to influence a minister, going through an MP, how to force an early day motion, how to engage with peers in the House of Lords. And if you want to know more about our work and work with us, it would be brilliant. This is a government that needs to be held to account. All governments should be held to account, but possibly particularly this one. And so we are, in our way, hoping to achieve that. So if you want to work with us, that would be brilliant. Okay, that was my quick little advert for ICOP. And I want to first introduce Dr. Paul O'Connell. Paul joined SOAS as a reader in law in September 2013. He had previously worked at the University of Leicester, and been a lecturer in law in the National University of Ireland in Galway. I have to say Ireland with a little roll on the R, from 2005 to 2008. He is interested in and works strenuously to facilitate our understanding of public law, human rights, particularly socioeconomic rights, and he's published on the impact of globalization. On human rights, I'm going to say very little about each of them because I could give you pages and pages of what they've both achieved. But as a framing for this evening, it is depressing how prescient Paul's work was in 2011. He published a paper called Let Them Eat Cake, in which he argues that the concept by the government of natural inequality, in other words, you can eat cake, but you've got to find it for yourself, that seemed to be dominant to him in 2011. Obviously, I think many of us would argue that's a situation in which we seem to find ourselves now in 2022. So the question really for us this evening is, what position can the law adopt? Can we achieve some kind of rectification of this imbalance, this injustice? Can we achieve some kind of rectification of that through the law, through human rights legislation, for example? I'll introduce Professor Conagherty at the same time, if I may, and then hand over to Paul. Professor Conagherty he's Professor of Human Rights Law from 2002 to 2009. He was Director of the Centre for the Study of Human Rights at the London School of Economics. His academic research focuses primarily on civil liberties, terrorism, and human rights. He was born in, I'm going to say it with a rolling R again, Ireland. I mean, I'm half Scottish, so I've got no right to do this, but I can't resist it. And he graduated in law from University College Dublin, moved to Wolfson College, Cambridge, became a fellow of Emmanuel College, and in 1990 came to King's and then moved to LSE. I mean, that's, again, like with Paul, it's a whistle-stop tour of a very rich career. He is also, and this is so exciting, not only a pucker academic, but also a practicing barrister, and he's a founder member of Matrix Chambers. You should watch what Matrix Chambers do because their work is really important. And he's been a visiting professor at Boston, Richmond, and New South Wales, and received honorary degrees from Brunel and Roehampton. Now, Professor Gherty has written about many aspects of what could be improved about the law being under attack. One might be Brexit, the way it made it possible for a government of this country to conceive of leaving the human rights legislation. He's also written about the ways in which he sees the judiciary, in his words, being drawn into the fray more heavily than they were 40 years ago. The role of the ICC, a thriving independent bar, is that so? Is that so at the moment? The influence of the Human Rights Act and the rulings of the European courts. Has this had an effect upon British legal judgments? And now that Baroness Hale is no more with us on the benches, in the judiciary, are we completely? I was going to swear then. Have we had it? Have we had it now that she's gone? And also talks about Tory hegemony, 1979 to 1997. What happened to loyally independence? Is it back or has it been squashed? Did it come back with the Blairite regime? Was that enough? Lots of questions, and now I'll hand over, if I may, to Paul to talk for about 15 minutes, perhaps. And could I also say there's a hashtag, LawICOP, LAWICOP, is that right? If you want to use that. And welcome to our online audience. Hi. Paul.
Thanks very much, Alison, for the introduction, and thanks to Alison, David, and the rest of the ICOP team for putting on this event. I also think, and I'll come back to why I think it's the case, I also think it's interesting and noteworthy that we've ended up, because of a couple of cancellations, with two Irish people speaking on the panel, talking about attacks on rights in Britain. And I explain why I think that's noteworthy a little bit later. So this series of seminars is timely and interesting and extremely valuable. But sorry, is it okay if I sit here? Can everybody see and hear me okay? Yeah. As Alison has intimated from sort of some work that I did in 2011 and work that lots of other people have done for years, this series of events would have been just as timely then and would have been just as timely 5 years ago, and unfortunately will be just as timely 5 years from now. And what I want to talk about in my contribution here is why that's the case, and why it is that we're constantly coming back to this recurrent concept of crisis, of the law being in crisis, of rights being in crisis. And I want to start it by quoting somebody who, in many ways, I disagree with, but who I think got it right with this one particular line. Louis Althusser, who was a French Marxist philosopher, has this excellent line where he says, the present crisis must not be allowed to obscure the reality of the deeper crisis that we're living through. And this was Althusser writing in the late 60s, early 70s, and that observation that he made is as pertinent now as it was then. And what I want to say about that is that when we talk about the attack on law and rights today, and again, perhaps in discussion we can come back and unpack that, because let's not forget that every attack on the law is conducted with the law. So at what point is it an attack on the law, or an attack of the law, or just the law in its ordinary motion? But the important point I'd like to make, just to begin as a provisional point, is that quite often we talk about it today in reaction to the COVID crisis and how that saw a massive increase in executive power, not just in Britain, but around the world. There's an NGO called Civicas who monitors the expansion of executive power and published a report mid last year on the expansion of state power and how it was undermining human rights right around the world in the context of COVID. Or else people might talk about the crisis precipitated by, as Alison mentioned, the Brexit vote, the turmoil that's caused in British politics, the impending economic recession that we're all facing, which incidentally was delayed by a few years because of COVID, was also been exacerbated by COVID in different ways. So we could talk about those as proximate causes of the current clampdown on rights in Britain. And that's very real, and that's very legitimate. And the current clampdown on rights in Britain is tangible. So again, many of you probably already know this, but if we just take the last 2 years, for example, we have the Covert Human Intelligence Resources Act of 2021, or what we call the Spy Cops Bill, which effectively legalizes criminal activity by undercover police officers. We have the the Nationality and Borders Bill, which criminalizes refugees and migrants, but also people who assist them. We have the Overseas Operations Act of 2021, which reduces the criminal liability of British armed forces who may commit war crimes against humanity while acting abroad. We have the famous piece of legislation that provoked the Kill the Bill movement, which curbed the right to protest. And I'm sure Conor will speak about this because he's written about it. The right to protest in Britain didn't need any more formal curbing. It was already fairly much on its way. But we also have now Suella Braverman, who was speaking at the Tory party conference yesterday, who's going to push ahead with a new Public Order Act to put further restrictions on the right to protest. And so bad as this and so severe is this attack that Michael Mansfield, I was going to say QC, but we're going to have to change that now, aren't we? Yeah, it's all changed. My public law lectures are going to have an awful lot of updating over the next few months to get those new acronyms in. But Michael Mansfield, KC, wrote in the preface to a recent book on the right to protest that we're effectively seeing the death of the right to protest in Britain today with these new legislative enactments. So this is all real, but what happens sometimes, and again I say this as an Irishman, as a perpetual outsider here in Britain, is there's a very parochial Britishness to think that this is an especially horrible British tendency, that this is because of Brexit or because of Boris Johnson or because of the Tories, but actually that's just not the case. So the OECD published a report in late 2021 which demonstrated that all around the world protest was expanding at an exponential rate over the last 15 years, that we'd seen an upsurge of protests in both so-called democratic and authoritarian states, and they go into some depth as to why they think these protests are occurring, a range of key factors being growing inequality, which again there's a wealth of research that speaks to this, the declining standards of living for the average worker. So again, in Britain and elsewhere, real wages have fallen in real terms for the last 30 years. All of this exacerbated by COVID, exacerbated by the more recent trends, but these were things that were happening already. These were processes that were already in train already. And in response to these growing protests around the world over the last 15, 20 years, there's been a growth in repressive state responses. So not just in Britain, but also in France, in Germany, in Turkey, in Iran, in the United States and elsewhere. And it's a combination of explicit legislative limitations on the right to protest, but also, crucially, a change in policing tactics, a change to a more militarized, more violent form of policing in relation to protest, a shift from what used to be referred to as a consensus approach to policing protest to a deterrent and militarized approach to policing process. So the crisis we are experiencing right now isn't just because of the immediate proximate causes we see, but it's because of much deeper structural crises. It's because of the fundamental structural crisis of the capitalist system, which has begun to unfold since the mid-1960s. And again, I'm covering an awful lot of ground in a short space here, so bear with me, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of these points in questions later. But William Robinson has written an excellent book on this, about the rise of the global police state. And I won't do his argument full justice, but if I was to sum it up, I'd put it this way. Because of how capitalism operates, and this isn't crony capitalism, this isn't neoliberal capitalism, this isn't Johnsonian or Trussian capitalism, this is capitalism. Because of how capitalism operates, it tends towards the concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people. It also tends towards the recurrent crises that we come back to, 2008, 2019, go back to the early 90s, go back to the mid-80s, go back to the 60s, 70s, the recurrent crises. And there's a difference there between structural and conjunctural crises. And we often get caught up in talking about the conjunctural crisis, the crisis that's in front of us. And what I want to say is that it's really important that we understand the deeper crisis that Althusser referred to. And so capitalism, in its ordinary operation, tends towards the increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people. It tends towards the degradation of the working class, falling real wages, which again is linked to the concentration of wealth, the undermining of rights, the sort of hollowing out of people's general sort of life experiences and life chances. And it also tends, and again, all the evidence attests to this. This isn't a new thing. The Club of Rome in 1972 published a report on this. It tends towards the irrevocable destruction of the environment, of the natural environment. And again, the OECD, and bear in mind, if you don't know already, the OECD is not staffed with Marxists. I'm not even sure there's that many Keynesians in there anymore. But even the OECD recognizes this in their report from 2021. growing inequality, climate breakdown, the degradation of workers' living standards, and the falling share to labour on a global scale are all producing protests around the world. Now, for states around the world, and again, I'm simplifying William Robinson's theory here, but go and read William Robinson's work because it's really good. The basic choice then states are confronted with is twofold. On the one hand, begin to take the steps to address the root causes of growing inequality, of climate breakdown, of the degradation of workers' lives and workers' rights, which would mean then taking on capitalism, which would mean then taking on international finance, which would mean then taking on the United States as the main guarantor of the global capitalist system in the world today. So that's one set of choices that the state faces. Or the other choice is police the consequences of the crisis. Respond to Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain, Black Lives Matter, trade unions by repressing their capacity to express their dissatisfaction with the system, by policing them in the most aggressive way as possible, and by undermining their capacity to build a political movement that would challenge the status quo that produces the crises in the first place. That's broadly speaking, in its simplest terms, what states are faced with. And what have states chosen to do uniformly around the world? Police the crisis. And so we've seen, not just in Britain, but everywhere you look around the world, and Robinson and others have done a great job documenting this, but as long ago, I say as long ago, but to me it seems like it was yesterday, but as long ago as 2003, the American Civil Liberties Union published a report on the global suppression of the right to protest. So this was already something that was well in train, long before the crash of 2008, long before our current set of conjunctural crises. So then we reach the position we're in now. What Alison has said is absolutely right. The current government in Britain, and I did want to put a question mark over the idea that Tory hegemony ended in 1997. Well, I mean, I don't even know if there was an interruption. We can discuss that. We can discuss that.
Don't think Blair is indistinguishable.
We think that we can discuss that. As Margaret Thatcher famously said, our greatest achievement was Tony Blair and New Labour. So we can discuss that one at another point. And also remember, New Labour failed to repeal the repressive anti-trade union legislation, which the Tories, once they got back into power, built upon again, and are building on even further. So again, it's not just attacks on the right to protest, it's attacks on the right to strike, it's attacks on freedom of expression, it's attacks on privacy, it's attacks right across the board, not to mention a whole raft of other legislation which further limits the already limited powers of the courts to judicially review certain state actions. So there's a whole range of things happening. But this again is not the result of this government. Right, so remember that when the Spy Cops bill was going through Parliament, the Labour Party abstained for the most part until there was outrage and they were forced to put forward some tepid proposals for amendment. On the Overseas Operations Bill, the Labour Party either abstained or a number of Labour Party MPs voted for the Overseas Operations Bill. On the restrictions on the right to protest, the Labour Party has either again abstained or been very tepid in its opposition. And again, on the attacks on migrants, the Labour Party is trying to outflank the Conservative Party on the right to apparently win votes. So even if we get a new government in Britain, and again, it would be great to get rid of this current government, but even if we get a new government in Britain, it's highly likely that the attacks we've seen on the right to protest and on other democratic rights will increase. They might change in terms of the pace at which it happens. They might change to some degree in terms of the form in which they happen, but the substantive undermining of those rights and the substantive attacks on those rights will continue because they are produced in large part by the structural crisis of capitalism, not by this or that bad politician, this or that bad prime minister. So where does that leave us in terms of law, and what can law do? Well, there's a couple of elements to it. In the first instance, those of us who oppose this government and those of us who oppose and in general defend human rights should make the best possible use of all existing legal instruments out there, in full knowledge that they are absolutely and fundamentally inadequate. So we should use the Human Rights Act for as long as it's still on the statute book. We should use judicial review. We should take full advantage of legal advisors when we're on protests. We should support all campaigns by Liberty and groups like that oppose this sort of legislation. But we're going to need an awful lot more than that. We're going to need an awful lot more than the existing legal mechanisms. And we're going to need an awful lot more than legal mechanisms. And this brings me back to the last point I'll say, to sort of round it out and connect it back to the Irish in a very insular and sort of selfish sort of way. But Abalam Varsivanandan, whose portrait is painted in the Students' Union downstairs, he noted in the mid-80s that the rights which we enjoy, the democratic rights we enjoy, were not the product of the sort of charity or beneficence of the ruling classes or of the bourgeoisie. They were the product of struggles by the working classes in the industrializing stage of capitalism. They were won through fights, quite often fights that broke the law in order to advance certain concepts of rights, which then became sort of internalized or legislated. And that remains the case today. Frederick Douglass, who many of you might have come across, a self-educated, freed slave from the United States, has this famous line which still holds true today as it did in the 1840s when he said it, which is that power concedes nothing without a demand, it never has and it never will. And in the 1870s, William Gladstone introduced a range of restrictions on the right to protest, particularly in and around London. And how did the working class respond? Well, the trade unions and organisations of what we call Fenians, or Irish Republicans, militant Irish nationalists, organised weekly monster marches through London of thousands of people and made the law unenforceable and compelled the government to then allow the law to lapse in the end. So it goes back to this point that we should make as much use as we can of the limited existing legal instruments that protect rights, in the full knowledge that they are wholly inadequate. And we might discuss this later, but kettling, for example, which is one of the more aggressive tactics of policing protest, has been held to be compatible with the Human Rights Act by both the European Court of Human Rights and the British Supreme Court. So the actual legal mechanisms that are there to protect rights have their inherent limitations, also linked to the class background of the judiciary and all these other issues. But the rights that we hold to be important, rights to protest, rights to serious democratic participation, right to strike, these rights can be defended, and they will most likely be defended in a meaningful way by the construction of mass movements that are willing to confront head-on the injustices of the new laws that have been passed by this and recent governments. So I'll leave it at that for the minute and hand it over to Conor, if that's all right.
Very good, very good. Am I straight on? Yeah, why not? Why not? Thank you very much, Paul. It's just a bit disturbing. It's two Irish people. It's a bit disturbing, Alison. I mean,
No, great start to the evening. I'm proposing to go straight to you and then take questions afterwards.
yeah, fantastic. I'll try and be as disciplined as Paul on the times. So, look, I'm going to be depressing as well. You can go on now if you want. I mean, I have a different spin, but it ends up more or less in the same place, to be honest with you. I mean, so be warned. David asked us to talk about attacks on the rule of law. How did we get here? I want to start by saying, where is here? Where is here? I'll tell you something, ancient history, when Paul was in nappies over in Ireland. I wrote an article in the New Statesman in the mid-1980s. Don't tell me you weren't in nappies. And I was very excited to get it in. It was, are we becoming a police state? And we were all absolutely sure we were becoming a police state because of something called the Public Order Act, which was then in a bill. And before that, 2 years before, when I just started teaching in England, we had the police bill, which we also thought was tyrannical. And we were right in some ways about both. We made a tremendous fuss rightly. Now, they're regarded as kind of evidence of a golden age of freedom now. And the police bill is held up now as an example of an ideal set of constraints on the police. But at that time, we thought they were outrageous. So there is in a very big important way, as a preliminary remark, there's a real problem with language here. There's a real problem with how do we express ourselves. Paul and I may have differences about the Labour Party. We agree on a lot of things. We might disagree on whether it's worth having a Labour government. But in 2011, Paul is right to write as he did and to talk as he did. And then in 2022, do we have the same language? You know, we say things about John Major. I said things about John. He was a Prime Minister years ago. But I said things about him now that have no bearing in relation to Johnson and whatever the new one is. What's her name? God, I can't remember her name. That woman.
Don't mention it.
Whatever. May. Well, God. Look. It's a real problem. How do we capture a moment in an accurate way? I mean, I wrote with Keith Ewing a book called Freedom under Thatcher in about the 1980s, and what was a sort of running theme was that there had been a golden age, that there was a now, and there was a then, and then was great, And how do we get from then to now? Let me tell you, there was no golden age. Let me tell you that. There was no golden age. I wrote an article called No Golden Age, just remembered. And I can show it, because what happened was, Keith and I, we thought, when was this supposed to have been good? And we went back and we wrote a book called Paul's Word, The Struggle for Civil Liberties. And it showed, I'm repeating a bit of it now, but that it was the same in the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s. So there is no now. That's a problem we've got to confront. There wasn't the period that we can fight to return to. Why? I'm going at it from a different angle than Paul's, but it is very complementary. There is, in my opinion, there was an incomplete democratic revolution in this country, and it's been constrained from its birth by authoritarian laws to hem it in, and by the maintenance of old structures that have preserved privilege. And so it's never escaped from that. And one of the main ways in which it's been ensnared our democratic potential and flummoxed and exhausted has been by the use of laws to constrain, not laws to liberate. Flashback history. 19th century, there wasn't the law thing. The empire is hugely important. I'm going to end on empire. The military were called out. They shot you. They may or may not read the Riot Act. And then there would be an Indemnity Act. If you weren't killed, you were sent to the colonies or you were hanged. It was very straightforward. And then what happened was, in the empire as well, actually, there was a move towards legalization. And it's facilitated by the legislation passed during the First World War. So the move to democracy is taking place at exactly the same time as the move towards emergency laws, the Defence of the Realm laws. And they were then followed in Ireland by the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act. But they were followed in the United Kingdom, generally in Great Britain, in Northern Ireland by something called the Special Powers Act. But they were then normalised in our legal system. So the stuff that had been introduced as an emergency measure during the Great War, as it's called, were then made part of the mainstream of law. So banning marches, that was lots of local laws and formalised in 1936, and national law. But before that, it was local laws. Local laws did an awful lot of this authoritarian work in the early democratic age. The Incitement to Disaffection Act, 1934, throw people in jail for trying to get the army to revolt. The Prevention of Order in Ireland Act, 1939. These were not emergency laws, but they were growing out of the normalisation of emergencies. And that's before I even mention the Emergency Powers Act of 1920. So we've never had a time when it wasn't the case that our legal system conspired to make near impossible, effective, lawful protest. So just as a little cameo, when in Ireland in 1916 there was quite a serious revolt, they introduced martial law, and I've been writing on this recently. I reread the stuff. It's full of imperial stuff, but it actually fell into disuse because they didn't need it, because they had enough powers in the Defence of the Realm legislation to pull a fella in and shoot him after a drumhead court-martial. They didn't need it. And martial law's fallen by the wayside because more effective legislative mechanisms have been created. Now, another side to this might be the much vaunted common law. But, and Paul has alluded to the class background of the judges, but I mean, I got into trouble with Keith Ewing in 1989 by saying, if you think a Bill of Rights will solve all this, think again, because the judges are even worse. And I stand by that at the time. Definitely. And the record of the judges was that they would manipulate the common law in order to fill the gaps that had been left by legislation. It's a very sad case in the 1930s. That what is now called Liberty was then called the National Council for Civil Liberties. And they got very excited by the possibility of using litigation strategically in order to inhibit police excess. And they created a framework which allowed their people, their lawyers, to argue that you shouldn't ban meetings on account of a breach of the peace that is never likely to happen. There was somebody meeting outside an unemployment training exchange and pointing out to people that they were unemployed not by their own fault, but by the direct consequence of government policy. And then Lord Chief Justice Lord Hewart said, I don't know what you're talking about. It's obvious the police should arrest these people. It's obvious because there's an apprehended breach of the peace, even though there wasn't when you go into the record. And this is the same guy who wrote a book called The New Despotism. He was against governmental interference in the lives of people, except when it involved the police interfering with the rights of protesters. So, is that ancient history? It's not. It's not. More recent, but still older, the 1980s, the 1990s, the judges, you rely on the judges at your peril. Now, there's decent ones. The judges are usually a generation behind everybody else. And so the judges in the 1980s who kept all those Irish people in jail for years unnecessarily, they'd done military service in the 50s, and they were desperate to maintain a security operation that they vaguely remembered had been essential to win the war. And the people in the more recent past have been sort of 1960s hippies, you know. So they've been a little bit more inclined towards freedom. And they were given the tool of the Human Rights Act by the early years of the Labour government. So, sure, there's been some give. And Paul has picked up a very important case, the Kettling case, called Austin, where it's so malevolent because the House of Lords, as it then was able to tell the European Court of Human Rights how to explain how Kettling could be consistent with the right to liberty. And the European Court of Human Rights said, oh, gosh, you know, this is a fantastic judgment. It's not even an exception to the right to liberty, but they still did it. And there are one or two cases. A very interesting recent case called Ziegler, which seems to expand the possibility of being able to persuade a magistrate that your conduct has been lawful. So this is a very related to Paul's point about the tactical use of law. If you can do a clever protest, which involves saving the world maybe or something, which the magistrate is keen on, I wouldn't advise this for equal pay, but saving the world, and you do it in a kind of proportionate way, you've got a fighting chance of being able to persuade a magistrate that you had a reasonable excuse. And, you know, surprisingly, the House of Law, the Supreme Court as it now is, will probably say, we won't disturb that judgment. That's a possibility. So there are one or two, but I am not sitting here building a case that we get from today back to the golden age, I say, it never existed, by getting the judges properly to interpret laws in a way that can deliver outcomes which we believe would have been delivered before. Now, last sequence about what the rule of law means for today. The legislation, Paul's talked about it, in terms of the government's conduct, it has acted in a brazenly illegal fashion on multiple occasions recently. A clever, I like it, chap called Jolyon Maugham came up with something called the Good Law Project, and for a couple of years he got away with it. So he the judges forgot to ask about standing, no objection was taken on standing, and he won a number of cases with other groups and singularly in his Good Law Project way by pointing out that the government just ignored the law. So we must be clear that government has become an habitual lawbreaker. And this is not just parties. They become habitual lawbreakers. And they do it under cover of the expectation that they will never be brought to court. And Jolyon briefly punctured that. I think the courts are going to make it much harder. But it was an interesting window into the illegality of, for example, commissioning of COVID-related matters. So they break the law. But they also make it very hard to be held to account in law. So whether or not they're breaking it, they create barriers to access to court, which are becoming increasingly brazen in terms of judicial review and in terms of access to justice generally. And they set up, characteristically recently, it's Johnson as well as Truss, they set up a review which is by some well-meaning enough lawyer, and they then ignore the review entirely and impose their own ideas about the extent to which it shouldn't be possible to challenge them. There was even a suggestion by a chap you may have forgotten called Dominic Raab, who was briefly Secretary of State for Justice, and Lord Chancellor, who actually thought it might be a wise idea for the courts to be able to be directed by government as to the interpretation of particular things. And so you actually had a government minister who supposedly protects the rule of law in a statutorily obliged way, who sees nothing wrong or illiterate about an executive being able to direct on the meaning of statutes in order to guide courts to their conclusion. And then there's civil liberties. Anticipate, a really interesting one is going to be industrial action coming up. I think there's going to be close enough to a sort of general strike. It won't be called a general strike. I think there's going to be an enormous number of people who are going to go on strike. When our own profession is balloting again, we people, on pensions and other things, and there's a sense of anger, I think that the neoliberal model has reached the universities, and they can't resist reducing pensions, and I think it's going to go wrong for them. I think it's going to go wrong for nurses. I think it's going to go wrong. The trains have blazed the trail. Mick Lynch has shown it's possible, and I think there's going to be, so watch a return to the 1980s. I think there's going to be quite a set of vindictive interventions by government, because if the country grinds to a halt with the legitimacy secured by ballots and with the support of the public, this business of capital to which Paul was referring is going to have a challenge on its hands. So let's watch that space. On the rule of law as a substantive goody two-shoes thing, forget it. There's a lot of human rights people who basically, look, I'll be honest, we're being recorded, so I'll try and do that stuff. So. But we're basically social democrats. So we like the idea that people be nice, and we're sort of for capitalism, so we have the right to property. But we kind of balance it with nice things to do with education, health, water, and so on. I believe in that. I am a social democrat. I think I'm more a social democrat than Paul, I think. But no, I don't mean that rudely. I don't mean that rudely.
I think as a compliment.
Yeah, I think it's but I don't think it's going to solve things. I don't think it's going to solve things. And I'm not sure in a democracy it should, to be honest with you. You know, we have 2 years to seek to get the Truss government out, if not less time. They may get them out quicker. I'm not sure I want the lovely Lady Hale, whom we all love, solving our socio-economic challenges. Though I am an absolute socio-economic rights person, I'd love to see them fought for and achieved in the democratic framework, even though it's an incomplete democracy. Last thing was Suella Braverman. Why is it an incomplete revolution? Why do they get away with it in this country? It might be a point of difference with Paul. I think it's worse in Britain than it is in comparable economies. When I left Ireland, it was a country in which the poor were very, very poor indeed. They remain poor, but they are less poor, the lower percentiles, than the poor in England. And I don't have data. Paul has data. But the situation here in this country is worse than it is in some. So I think we have to ask, why is the country not normalized, wised up to this? And we had Suella Braverman, who is in many ways an emblematic of the problems, who speaks fluent French because she went on an Erasmus program, and who presides over the collapse of Erasmus, cheering on the rejection of things European, whose parents came from Africa, and who applauds the immigration rules that she currently has. And she said yesterday how marvelous empire was, how terrific it is, how she's proud of it, and nobody should diss it. Until we acknowledge, and this is going to be a plug for my next book, until we acknowledge the dominant force of the imperial drama in the lives of British people, I don't think we're going to make progress as a country. So in our field here, the anti-terrorism laws, the authoritarian laws, are creatures of the control of empire. So what's learnt in killing and imprisoning the Indian people and the African people, the Kenyans, and torturing them, what's learnt there comes here. And we have this deluded approach to the rule of law, which is part of our imperial delusion. And it needs to be punctured because the country will never grow up unless it punctures it. End of me. Too long.
Excellent. Two fantastic talks. I've got lots of questions I could ask, but I think I should be democratic about this and open it to the floor. What I suggest is that we take 3 questions at a time and then ask the panelists to respond. Have we got any questions? You might want a few minutes to cogitate. You got a question? No.
He'll have a question. I know that guy.
Have we got, oh, brilliant, well done, you've actually got mics. We had trouble getting hold of the mics, that's brilliant, thank you very much. Anybody want to, do we have one over here? Yes, good, we've got one here, excellent.
Thank you. Still forming, so sorry if it's badly articulated. In terms of, well, what you both said about, I suppose thinking about the union thing, and I do also agree that, yeah, we are moving towards general strike or something like it. And also the kind of choice between states of addressing the causes or policing the effects. What about the choice of the people in that? And the general strike is one representation of that, but we do also have, at the moment, quite a rising movement of people resisting that policing itself. So you have intervention in immigration raids, you have growing cop watch networks, you know, where we're seeing more instances of this. How do you perceive that kind of playing out? And is there a kind of a future where that is kind of constant or, you know, effective enough that it could, you know, actually amount a real challenge to the way in which law is currently used?
Thank you very much, excellent question. David, do you want to wait for a, you got a, we should use them as we got them.
And also for the web.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
As one of the people who organised this event, when we were planning it, we were kind of hoping there'd be a bit of a debate about whether the rule of law is a good thing. Mm-hmm. Now, personally, I actually agree with both of the speakers. I'm very happy with both your conclusions. It's not. But I'd like there to be in this room a bit more place for the other side of that debate, if that's all right. And here I'm sort of doing a bit of devil's advocate, just because I think these views need to be in the room. One of the things which is very strange about this government, compared certainly to other British governments, is the willingness it has to say what we're doing is going to be illegal, and that's fine. Over the Human Rights Act, we're going to breach the European Convention, but that's all right. We're going to make it very difficult. If RAB's measures had got passed, the draft bill, etc., was going to say, in effect, we're going to regularly and consistently breach the European Convention, but that's all right because we're going to make it very difficult for people to get to Strasbourg and overturn us. Or, again, apologies, it may be that either of you spoke about this, but I don't think I heard this. The really quite interesting discussions about the Northern Irish Protocol and the idea that a government can quite legitimately do, what was that phrase, a sort of deliberate, targeted breach of international law, and that's fine. Now, it seems to me that it's worth pausing on that and commenting on that and to try and put this in some context, because both of you mentioned the miners. I don't know if you've seen that moment in Sherwood where they're going back to Thatcher speaking in the mid-80s, and she's trying to sum up why Scargill's evil, why the miners have to be smashed. So the worst thing about the miners is they don't believe in the rule of law. That's the thing which unites all of us in our coalition. We're all united around. So there has been some kind of big shift. And I kind of understand why people want to keep on saying that and use that as a way of sort of delegitimizing this government. I mean, like you, I know that in the end that means giving too much faith to judges. I accept that argument. But I think it is worth commenting on that and saying this is something that's kind of weird and disturbing to people, and to some extent being on the side of people that are disturbed by it, if only then to maybe push them a bit further, maybe.
Thank you very much. Have we got a third question to make a little thing, or should we go with those two? Yes, here's one. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I think it's probably a follow-on from the previous question. But you said sort of there's no now, and I thought that perhaps that also meant there was no then. We're not returning to anything. We're moving forward to something. And if we don't like the governments that we have, or we don't trust that we have a complete democracy, and we also don't trust that judges are going to protect rights or even create more rights or read more rights into legislation, what can we look to try and avoid the things that you've been talking about?
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think the audience want to hear from both of you on this. Paul, would you like to start, as you were the first speaker?
Thanks very much. So they're all good questions, and any one of them could lend itself to its own 2-hour session with different speakers and different perspectives. So let me take on the first question. So what choices do the people make? Just to qualify slightly what I said as well, as I said, it was a simplification of Robinson's argument and also a simplification of my view on the nature of state power. States don't really have a choice because capitalist states reproduce capitalism, and so they're always going to make the choice that leads to the reproduction of capital accumulation, particularly with a short-term focus on returns, which again is part of what explains where we are with climate breakdown. Before COP26, John Kerry, the US Special Envoy on climate change, said this is our last chance to do anything about climate breakdown. And what did COP26 do? The precise square sum of sweet FA, you know what I mean? Because again, the imperatives of capital accumulation mean that the priority is short-term gain. So the state didn't really have a choice, but the people do. So that's an important question. This is first thing. I would love us to be heading towards a general strike. For a variety of reasons, I don't think we are. These are reasons to do with the weaknesses of the British labour movement, the paucity of union density in comparison to 30 years ago, and also what I'd call the dead hand of labourism and the influence that exercises over the British labour movement. I think what we might see is generalised striking. So I think we might see an awful lot of strikes, and some more or less coordinated with others. But what's required to mount and sustain a general strike as a political intervention, I don't think is there at the moment. And I think one small indication of that was the willingness of 2 of the more militant trade unions to cancel their action in order to show respect for the funeral of dearly departed Elizabeth Windsor, and also the Trade Union Congress to call off their Congress, and the Wigan Diggers Festival to cancel the Wigan Diggers Festival to show respect for the Queen. While, let's not forget, King Charles, although I think he might have still been Prince Charles at this precise moment in time, sat in the church of his mother's funeral mass and sacked 200 workers without batting an eyelid. So the trade unions were showing respect because, again, that's part of the ingrained tendency towards reformism and labourism. So I don't think we're moving towards a general strike. But what choices do the people have? Well, the people have the choices of fight or flight, effectively. This government has shown itself on a whole range of issues, not just this government, but Johnson and May before that. And let's not forget, Theresa May gets a pass now because she criticised Johnson, or maybe she criticised Truss, but it was Theresa May who sent vans around telling migrants to leave Britain, and it was Theresa May who brought in a raft of repressive measures in different contexts. And the choices people have is accept the slow deterioration of, and I agree completely with Conor, there was no better past. Conor gave some of the historical examples, but there are many instances in the past of the British Navy bombarding towns around the coast of Britain for refusing to comply with the sort of demands of either the military or of local sort of lords. There's also a really good book called Albion's Fatal Tree, which if you've never read it, I'd encourage you to run out and pick up a copy if you can. But it's about a period in the I'm trying to get me centuries right now, the 18th century in Britain, where the number of pieces of legislation passed by Parliament that could result in the death penalty multiplied exponentially. And they're almost always offences concerned with crimes against property. But at the same time, the number of actual executions declined. And this is one of the riddles of sort of British legal history. And there's, Douglas Hay has a great piece where he discusses it. But for people here now, we can either accept this And again, not that it was all rosy in the past, but we can accept this deepening crisis, this entrenchment of authoritarianism, this move towards a global and a local police state, or we can start building forms of politics that are fundamentally antagonistic to that. And this, again, is, again, me and Conor agree on an awful lot of things, but again, on the fundamental politics of it. So I think social democracy as a political form is historically finished, that it had an important role to play, particularly in Western Europe and advanced capitalist countries in the early 20th century, but that because of the nature of the crisis of capitalism, because of the deep structural terminal decline of capitalism on a global scale, social democracy isn't an answer to it. In fact, it ends up being an apology for the worst excesses of the system while trying to patch up some of the other elements of it. So we need to develop forms of politics that are openly antagonistic, not just to the government, but to the system of social and economic relationships that bring us to where we are now. And something like the anti-migrant raids and stuff like that is really hopeful. Still too small, still too sporadic, but something like that is hopeful. I can't give anything more than a general answer like that. And in that context, while building that politics, we should be absolutely cynical in our use of the law. If we can deploy the law in some way, shape or form to win a minor victory, we should do it. And people should look at, for an example, Abaklali Abase Majondo in South Africa, which is a movement of shack dwellers who use the law and mobilize the law, but are Fanonian Marxists who are committed to the overthrow of capitalism in South Africa and globally. So they have no illusions about what they're doing, but they use it practically. So we should look at that as well. The rule of law question, well, that's a small one, David. One of the first things I get students to read when they come to study law at SOAS is an essay by Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn was an American historian. He wrote a famous book called The People's History of the United States, which upset most white Americans, in particular Italian Americans, because of what it exposed about Columbus and his crimes and so forth. But he has this great little essay called the Rule of Law, in a collection of essays called The Conspiracy of Law. And the point that Zinn makes, the simple point, is that absolutely the rule of law has been, and this is E.P. Thompson as well, has been a historical victory, and it has been progress. And it is great that, by and large, generally speaking, unless you're black, you can't be shot on the streets here without there being any police accountability. So that is progress. That's a step in the right direction. There has been some moves in that way. But every repressive thing that happens is the rule of law. Every immigration detention centre is sustained by the rule of law. These new provisions that have been brought in around protest is the rule of law. So there's that dynamic there, and that's okay for me because I'm a Marxist and I understand contradiction, and that's how things work, right? And it's not that the rule of law is an illusion, it's not that the rule of law is a lie, it's that the rule of law is inherently contradictory, like every actual thing. And so that, again, in specific contexts, we, while trying to build a fundamentally transgressive politics, should also, at appropriate moments, defend the rule of law without doing what the middle classes do and what the liberals do, which is fetishize the rule of law, which is come to believe the fairy tales they tell themselves about the rule of law. So I think you're right, David, that it is complex and it's a much bigger discussion. And as Conor mentioned, people like Jolyon Mohan and that, who definitely have done useful public service through relying on the rule of law, I'd say they've also done public mischief by relying on the rule of law in the kind of the Miller cases and stuff like that, in a way that fed the entrenchment of the right in Britain by trying to oppose the Brexit process through top-down elitist mechanisms and so forth. So there's a whole, complex relationship around that. And the final question, which was about, I suppose in a way, the sort of, because we have come to fairly rotten conclusions in some way in terms of well, the law isn't going to save you, and that isn't a new conclusion, pretty much every social democrat. And it was one of the interesting things, Conor and Keith did fantastic work on this in the 80s. I know Conor's ideas have shifted a little on some of the aspects of it, but Keith Ewing is sort of steadfast. I love his collection of articles which are the futility of the Human Rights Act, and 10 years later, the continuing futility of the Human Rights Act.
He doesn't compromise.
Five years later, the bonfire of the liberties. And that's actually another important point. I think that book was 2010 or 2011. Yeah, it was early enough, and it was like a bonfire of the liberties. So Keith Ewing was writing about this attack on our rights back then. So again, this is this point about the current crisis not being the actual crisis, but being a sort of a flash of lightning in a much bigger storm. And so I think that's important. But what can we do? And I think it relates to this gentleman's question as well. I think, again, time and time throughout history, there are very many instances of seemingly omnipotent governments or seemingly inescapable circumstances, and then we see what Karl Marx would call the old mold of history. Then we see the emergence of new social movements, of new antagonisms that are able to transform the existing relationships. The one thing I'd say, though, is that we have to be absolutely clear-sighted on this. And again, this is why I say, with the greatest respect and sort of understanding the history of social democracy, that social democracy is a spent force. Social democracy was conceivable because there was still the capacity for growth within capitalism, and that was linked to the continued exploitation of colonies and so forth. That has been exhausted. And the last 40 years have been the István Mészáros, who's a Hungarian Marxist, what he calls this the terminal decline of capitalism. Capitalism in its senile phase. But capitalism as a social system isn't going to shuffle off humbly from the historical stage. It's going to become more brutal, more authoritarian. And again, going back to what Conor mentioned about empire, the things we see here are still pretty nice compared to what happens in other parts of the world, facilitated and supported by the British, the US, the EU. Let's not forget that imperialism is as European as ethnic genocide is as well. So the idea of sort of European values that are somehow pristine and above Britain's crimes is something, again, we shouldn't sort of entertain. So I think that history shows time and time again that there can be new movements that emerge, and that they're quite often heterodox in terms of how they relate to traditional understandings of social change. And the very last thing I'll say is that in 1917, and I know David would know this story, in early 1917, when Lenin was on a covered train on his way into Russia, he sent a letter to a friend saying, "This place is dead, man, there's nothing happening here. Like, politically, Russia, there's nothing happening. It's, the people are too backward and the government is too omnipotent." And of course, by the end of that year, we know it was a different scenario. So these things can change quicker than we'd like, but I think we do have to be clear-sighted in terms of both our analysis and prescription, and that relates not just to law, but to all the other dimensions of it.
Fabulous. I'll follow up straight away. Very interesting. It paused on a lot of the work, so I'll focus on what he's focused on to sharpen my response. My friend Keith Ewing, a very important, powerful writer. If you write Bonfire of the Liberties in 2010, after 13 years of Labour government, it must mean that there are no liberties to be burnt today, because they're gone. And I have real difficulty with that. I have real difficulty with the language here, that after 13 years of Labour government, the liberty was laid waste to. And this is where Paul and I differ. I think there is a difference between a Labour government and a Conservative government. Paul said earlier that he hoped this government would be removed. Why? Because it'll be replaced by Labour. And Paul sees, he interrupted to make clear, he saw no substantial difference between the Thatcher period and the Major period on the one hand, and Blair and Brown. I do. I see effects on ordinary people that are transformative. So we differ. We may agree on the macro structural decline of capitalism, but we are, I think, at odds on whether it's worth voting for a party that ameliorates the outcomes. On the precise points, I think the first question, I agree with Paul. I don't think there'll be an old school general strike. I think there'll be a tremendous amount of anger, which is reflected in sporadic strikes, which will be mainly rule adhering and will be hard to control. I haven't seen the levels of people willing to embrace strikes in Britain during my engagement, adult engagement here. It's clear that rational capitalism is very concerned by the initiation of a deeper level of war by trusts. When you have the Telegraph calling the markets left-wing or woke, and when you have the IMF warning Britain to get a grip, much less the World Bank, long pink, you realize that rational capitalists are very concerned that what Paul has said will be understood and will lead to the chaos that they are very scared of. My vision of what will happen is, and this again is another indirect way of saying why I support Labour, is there'll be tremendous anger. There already is in this country. It's for those of you who are abroad and see other countries and so on, there's such anger here because, of course, it's a failing country and they're absolutely being impoverished by direct action of their government. And that's this government, not the government of 13 years ago. And it's not an inexorable consequence of capital's collapse. It's decisions being made by individuals and out of an ideology which is extreme and cruel. And I worry that that anger will focus on various irrational populist celebrities, that it will produce an upsurge of a type that would be difficult to control. And I applaud the possibility of a Labour Party which can harness anger, and which is not the Corbyn Labour Party, which is not a group of people who are committed to a much more radical transformation of Britain and who've managed to take control of a traditional political party in order to do so, and failed because the British people had a chance to vote for Corbyn and decided not to in a large scale. Now, we can talk about the number of people who did, and we can talk about the kind of the people who were energised, like my older children, and how important the Corbyn insignia was, but the Labour Party in the Corbyn mould failed. And maybe it would have succeeded, maybe it was to do with Brexit. I know all the explanations to why it failed, but it didn't. I hope that the anger will be harnessed by a party that can sing God Save the King. Do you think I care about God Save the King? But I know what they're doing, just like I knew what they were doing in '96 when Peter Mandelson wrapped them up in a bulldog and the Union flag. This is a deeply conservative, imperialistic country, and they will run a mile from anything radical. So, unless we're Lenin, which I respect from Paul, and we hope for a coup, and we go home and we find that there's been a seizure of power by unelected people, driven by an analysis which they impose, unless we want that, we have the Labour Party. We may want that, and we may pray that we don't end up with a Stalin, although we may applaud Stalin, I don't know, or we may pray that we don't end up with the leader of China today. We are taking a little bit of a risk, although I understand it, when we back coup as the possible solution. If we don't back a coup, we have the current system. The third question before the last one, what should we do? Well, the Supreme Court is extremely worried for its own existence. They have pulled back on any engagement with anything outside the norm, because actually they think, I have no special knowledge here, but I went into the record for an article I wrote about Lord Reed's court. I think they're very concerned about a full frontal throttle attack on them. What about this? This is very, very, very liberal, jeepers, is a all-party agreement outside the Tories for a proportional representation system of government, and an agreement to have only one candidate for any of the Green, Scots Nats and Liberal and Labour parties against the Tories, with the promise it will only do one thing, this new Parliament. In 6 months, it will pass an Electoral Reform Act. It won't have a stupid referendum. It won't have any stupid consultations. It won't waste time with the newspapers. It won't get all the academics to argue what's wrong with the new system. It will create a new framework for a guarantee of a progressive coalition, and then of a fresh election. That's what I would do. That's what I would do. I was in Ireland yesterday. They were all saying, oh, the PR system is terrible and so on. I don't care. Something which allows 34% of those who vote to put a party into power permanently, like the Conservative Party, is a disaster for the country, bound to be great. That's a practical suggestion. That's a practical, super liberal suggestion. It depends on believing that it makes a difference who's in power. And that's why when Paul said he hoped the government would be got rid of, I'm interested in why. Because if there's no difference between any of them, it's a waste of energy to try and bring trust down. In some ways, we might end up applauding the barefacedness of her capitalist effrontery. I'm not there. I think it makes a difference. Rule of law. I think you misheard us. I think we're both keen on the rule of law. I think we are. I think Paul said, use it as best you can. He name-checked my clever little intellectual remark was going to be E.P. Thompson, so he got there before me, in Whigs and Hunters, where he says at the end, this thing matters. I'll tell you why I think it matters. This is where I have changed. Paul was gently alluding to something. I wrote an article for The Guardian. They asked me to write an article about something on which I'd changed my mind. I wrote an article on, I'd changed my mind about whether I'd changed my mind. Because I, for ages, said I hadn't changed my mind about human rights, but I decided bloody hell I had. This is partly why. I hated judges. hate is too strong. I never met them, so I didn't risk hating them personally. But I'm at the bar now, and I meet these people in their white ties and so on. And I am glad to have a completely independent branch of law which doesn't care about prime ministers, which provides its own social support for judges and barristers who argue cases. And it's a net good in this country at the moment that we have a judiciary which may be very right-wing and very reactionary, but has imbibed the idea that government should not act criminally and should not act lawlessly, and apply it when they get the chance. I think that's not bad as a defence for the rule of law, David. Northern Ireland we haven't discussed. I think the British are going to surrender on Northern Ireland. I think they are surrendering at the moment. Truss is that some sort of thing invented by Mr. Macron to give her a chance to meet Europeans because nobody comes here. Can you imagine having the funeral of the Queen and the British Prime Minister who's just become Prime Minister meets the Irish fellow who naturally wanted to meet her, the Polish person, and then she must have rung up Trudeau and said, please do us a favour, meet me. Nobody else met her. What a decline. So she has to meet some of these European leaders, and Mr. Macron, whom she doesn't like, obviously, because he's French, has given her the chance. They're scared, and they're going to go slow on the protocol, and they have Steve Baker and they have Heaton Harris. They're big Brexity guys in Northern Ireland. They're going to surrender. And watch this space. They're going to declare an amazing victory over Europe, and Britannia rules the waves, and this Express is going to go hysterical while they surrender. So I think the heat is going to be off.
Okay, fabulous. Paul, you want to follow up on that? Thank you very much, Conor.
I do, yeah, because I think we don't have all the time for it. And of course, this is in the first instance a series of talks about law specifically, and you have to let the legal academics in. But invariably, it's brought us around to politics because the two are so intimately intertwined. I also saw E.P. Thompson on Conor's notebook. That's why I thought I'd snatch that before I get in. But on the point, so. And again, because we can only talk in brief terms here, but there's a couple of straw men there about coups and Stalin and that's all fine, you know, because we're having a superficial discussion about it just now. But just talking concrete terms, in real terms, they had a slogan in France, not at the last election, but the one before, which was "Vote Macron now, get Le Pen in 5 years." And what the historical record demonstrates invariably across the world over the last 100 years is that it's the liberals and social democrats of the centre that roll the red carpet out for the more extreme right. And Italy's a good example of that recently. It was a series of technocratic governments put in place by the European Union that decimated the living standards of Italian people, that introduced repressive laws against protest, against the right to strike and other things, that then paved the way for the neo-Nazi, who you can't call a neo-Nazi, even though she declared herself a neo-Nazi at a different point in time. But it's illiberal to call her a neo-Nazi, I gather. And likewise, in Britain, it has been the likes of Blair and others who paved the way for the more reactionary forms of politics we see in Britain today. Conor and I are going to disagree fundamentally on the impact of the Blair years on the lives of working people in Britain. And again, there's important reasons around this to do with the dynamics of capitalism and capital accumulation. Blair was fortunate in certain key respects in that he came into government at a period at which the credit-fueled boom within global capitalism that came to an end in 2007, 2008 was just getting off the ground. And governments could borrow cheap, and what the Labour governments did successfully is they supported and facilitated capital and capitalists to enrich themselves and grow wealthier, and then contributed a modicum of redistribution in order to balance the scales. But once the crisis started to hit, they flipped back to form. And the scrapping of many of the reforms that were brought in around sort of childcare, around public employment and a range of other things were begun by Gordon Brown's Labour government. It was Gordon Brown's Labour government that started the austerity assault that Cameron and co carried on. And in doing that, and in overseeing the managed decline of the northern industrial heartlands of Britain and so forth, they created the conditions of desperation, of poverty, of exclusion, of democratic marginalisation that is the fertile breeding ground for right-wing ideas. Samir Amin, who was a fantastic Egyptian Marxist, once summed this up quite pithily. He said that in the absence of progressive alternatives, the people who are ground down by capitalism and capitalist society retreat into reactionary ones. And that's the big problem we have, that when the progressive alternative is the technocracy or the sort of modest reformism of the liberal and social democratic centre, that's not going to hold. And again, it goes back to historical context. Every chance, maybe not every chance, some chance that in the early 20th century I would have been a social democrat, some possibility that that could have been the case. But social democracy in the early 21st century, in the teeth of climate breakdown, and again, this isn't hyperbole, this isn't fanciful thinking. Every shred of reliable scientific evidence attests to the scale of climate breakdown, and most recently the floods in Pakistan demonstrate one aspect of it, the heat waves we had here recently also. In the face of that, in the teeth of that, to imagine that proportional representation is the progressive utopia that you offer people is, I'd say, fanciful, is, I'd say, unrealistic. I despise Slavoj Žižek, not personally because I don't know him, but I despise his buffoonery, pseudo-radicalism. But he does have a really good point where he said once, there's nobody more utopian than the person who thinks they can patch up capitalism. And he was right about that. And on PR, Conor and I grew up at different times in Ireland, and we've had PR.
Don't rub it in.
We've had PR, and for all intents and purposes, we've had the same two parties trading government since independence. Also, let's not forget, Italy has PR, Sweden has PR. And again, I won't say simplistically, that's why they now have fascists in government, but PR isn't the panacea we think it is. And again, this brings us back to the law, brings us back to the rule of law. Legal and institutional forms are important, but root causes are more important. And legal and institutional forms cannot address the root causes. And unless we begin with an analysis of the root causes, then we're just perhaps mitigating and slowing the trajectory into the very inevitable and predictable future, which is the increased move towards authoritarianism, climate breakdown, growing inequality, and everything that comes with it. So I just say I disagree on some points there.
Yeah, you've had your say. Thank you very much. That's brilliant. Yes, one question here. Have we got any more? Because we're going to finish at 8:30. As we lost a speaker, you noticed we lost a speaker. So we will...
Not during the meeting, by the way.
No, fine. I mean, we didn't need him here because these two are so brilliant. But just hold on a second. Question here. Have we got a couple more questions to finish off the evening? Sorry. You got 2 questions online?
Oh, great. We'll do those 3.
Okay, so we'll take those 3. But could your answers be... I'd love to hear you all evening, but could your answers be... quick and
We're
dirty.
down for our brevity. We're down.
How could you accuse us of being long-winded?
Never. Please, sir.
I tend to agree with Paul. Social democracy is finished, and it's finished for various reasons throughout Europe, not just in Britain. As you've rightly said, most social democracy governments are coalitions in Europe, and they've all failed, and they've partly failed because they are coalitions. They've had to water down basic social democratic goals in order to be in government. And this has...
Can I just interrupt? I love your contributions,
Sure.
but what's your question?
Oh, I don't have a question. They're discredited. All I would say is just a few things.
No, not a few things. You've already declared your support for Paul O'Connell, further humiliating me. Now we have to listen to a few more supportive remarks. I know this man very well.
I know.
I wouldn't say there's going to be a general strike, but let's just remember that it was reading the Riot Act in 1889 in Bradford, which paved the way for the creation of the Labour Party. Since then, Labour Party has been going backwards and attacking working people. Now, as you said, including New Labour, we are, if we are afraid of the Liz Truss government, we should be more afraid of what's going to come next. The Liz Truss government is dominated by the Institute of Economic Affairs and the hedge funds which prop them up. What's going to happen after Liz Truss goes is a Dominic Raab government, which would be a serious assault on human rights. So I think that we should be a bit more careful. What I would also submit to you is that I must differ with you about the Good Law Project, because I think it's antagonized everybody with very little to show for it. And now we've got something called the Bad Law Project, which is deliberately provoking legal actions on other issues. And the human rights community, if there is such a thing, has been shooting itself in the foot. There are all kinds of deep divisions in human rights, which are going to make it more difficult to defend the HRA and so on. So I think we should actually be talking about that
So,
as well.
thank you. I'm going to ask you to thank you very much. Here's a question from all these, everything this evening is male. Women, come on, remember what to
Well,
do.
we have two online. There might be women.
Well, Declan Owens, partly on the basis of what Paul and Connor are saying, can you see this? My view is that the rule of law has never actually existed in the UK, especially in the jurisdiction of its occupied constituent part known as Northern Ireland. Would they agree that the rule of law has not existed and will not manifest until we have a socialist society which actually establishes a fully realised democracy in Britain for the first time? Is there another question as well?
Yep, so this question is going
Would you like to read it out to us?
Nope, I'll have Dr. Deepa speak her question.
Thank you. And my name is Deepa Driver. I'm a trade unionist and also the legal observer in the case of Julian Assange, whose case is going through the various courts at the moment. I'd like to split my question into two parts, if I may. Firstly, and apologies to Professor Gaiety for what I'm about to say, but as a Black woman, I would like yourself and others who are suggesting sorry, can you still hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. As a Black woman, I'd like to encourage those who are suggesting that we should be pushing for a Keir Starmer-led Labour government and also saying that the time of Blair was a relatively progressive time, to recognise the fact that Tony Blair is a war criminal and, like Keir Starmer, is a pathological liar. Like Keir Starmer, who follows in his wake, there is a support of privatisation, of lobbying, and there's also an exceptionally good use of propaganda to manipulate the liberal intelligentsia into encouraging people to presume, like Truss was an improvement on Johnson, that Starmer will be an improvement on Truss, which is definitely not the case. And I just want to remind you that the Labour Party at the moment is led by a human rights barrister who has no qualms abstaining on issues of human rights, and in fact whose PLP is gleefully, as you can see from the Labour files and other investigations from Al-Qaeda, engaged in racism and in and acting as a tool of the establishment. But this, on a very practical note, I besides saying how much I enjoyed all your contributions, I wanted to ask what you think about the fact and what we can do about the fact that lawyers and judges are currently abstaining on one of the most important cases of political prisoners in the UK, given that the defendant in the case has been spied upon and his privileged legal conversations have been spied upon, which of course has some connection to the rule of law and something that lawyers and judges should be worried about, that the extraditing party has sought to murder the defendant, and we have 30 US government insiders confirming that. And most importantly, much like the legislation in relation to the war on terror allowed people to declare Guantanamo as a place where you could capture somebody, not give them a trial, send them off, the extradition act is being misused to take a journalist who published accurate information and published it outside the US of US war crimes to now, and who's not a US citizen and never undertook journalistic activities in the US, to be extradited to the US while the legal profession is completely silent and is not doing anything. And I'd also urge everyone to be out on the bridges at Westminster and Lambeth Bridge at 1 o'clock on Saturday for the historic human chain surrounding Parliament in support of Julian Assange. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deepa. I'm going to ask you, Connor, to respond.
Yeah,
if
sure.
I may.
I mean, absolutely. There's no need to thanks, Paul. There's no need to apologise to me at all for that remark. Absolutely none. Absolutely fine. I think there's only one thing I would say, which is basically, it's very interesting the way law and politics have intermingled here. And it's just about, take Declan's question. Would they not agree the rule of law is not and will not manifest until we have a socialist society which actually establishes a fully realised democracy? I think there's there's a difference between us here. I mean, we can all decide that everything that goes on at the moment is terrible for various reasons, and they're all the same. And we can await the realization of a socialist society. But we need to have some indication of how it's going to come about. I gave him an unfair jibe, Paul, about wishing for a Lenin. But how many of us would be delighted if there were a coup overnight where a combination of trade unionists who seized control and sought to deliver the fully realized socialist society and did away with the stuff that we've spent most of this evening, many of us, treating with contempt? How many of us like that? I mean, do we owe ourselves the honesty of actually saying that would do me, that would do me? And if we're not going to do that, then we need to work out whether we're choosing self-righteous silence and constant criticism over people who seek smaller, less glamorous, not as dramatic gains. Because where I totally agree with Paul, here beside me, is that it is managing a decline. And it is, I'm with the analysis of Shriek and other people I've read, which say, look, the thing is over, the game is over. And what Paul said about the early noughties is true, about the capital credit and so on. And the game is up, and the game was partly imperial. And how do we manage it? And the climate change thing, what are we going to do? I agree with that. And so my idea for doing something is to engage in short-term action to alleviate the misery of some people. That's my short-term goal. And that includes empowering the rule of law, which is more likely from a Labour government.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes. Paul, could you give us a quick concluding salvo on this?
Yeah, I do. I think I said more than enough. I'll say one thing just, and again, we disagree in substance, and that's fine. There are substantive political disagreements. I just do think that the idea of a coup and so forth rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of socialism and what socialism is and how socialism
Well, what
is
do you want,
realised.
Paul? Just in the minute you've got left, what is the ideal for you?
Well, there's no ideal for me because it's not about me. But what socialism
No, for your
is-
vision, for your vision.
Yeah, but it's not my vision. Remember, this is the vision of 150 years of socialists, Marxists, trade unionists, international working class. But the fundamental principle of my conception of socialism is working class self-emancipation. And that goes back to Declan's point. What that entails and what that requires is the most profound, deepest and widespread forms of democracy. Not just the formal pageantry we get every couple of years to select which eaten, educated toff gets to pull the switches and stamp the newly minted legislation, but decisions over what happens to our pensions, decisions in the workplace here. So SOAS, for example, where you guys are today, our current senior managers are militarising the security in and around SOAS. So we have no say in that as members of staff, but it's done to repress protests, to intimidate trade unionists, and to try and facilitate student experience. But the new website has loads of protests at SOAS, so he'll enjoy that for our USP. So my understanding of socialism is about the fullest democratization of every aspect of society, which crucially can never be achieved under capitalism, because capitalism by its very nature is despotic, in large part because of what you mentioned earlier, the right to private property. Not the individual's right to a pair of socks, but the ownership of the means to produce and reproduce life, which is concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people, and which then manifests as political power, as social power, and again, brings us to where we are now. So,
fair enough.
Completely different understanding of socialism.
Okay, thank you very much. We are going to conclude now. I want to thank our speakers, and I want to also urge you to consider that whatever your views are, whichever side you fall on this debate, which has been absolutely brilliant, it is worth considering that you could work with us, because we send briefings, expert briefings, to every MP and every member of the House of Lords. A lot of them don't read them, but those who do come back to us to ask for clarification. That it is possible to still believe, as both these gentlemen do, I think, in expertise. We have expert academics, we have expert students. We can teach these people in Westminster stuff that they need to know. They may not know they need to know it, but we're making an effort. And so it's an energetic reimagining of the fact that the people do have power. So on that slightly upbeat note, a little bit of hope, thank you both so much. Absolutely brilliant evening. Thank you so much.
That's wonderful.
just as you're leaving, may I remind you, please, this is just the first of 2 more sparkling events. Please attend Law Under Attack, 20th of October, 3rd of November. Sign up, be there or be square. It would be lovely, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys, for coming.